A nation in default, an economy in ruins, a desperate struggle for millions.
Here, there are so many people hungry, miserable, without jobs.
Now, after 4 years of crippling U.S. sanctions, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro senses an opportunity.
Hopefully we can find paths of closeness, of respect, paths of mutual benefit.
Donald Trump is out. Joe Biden is in. He wants to negotiate a deal.
Paths that allow us to normalize relations between the United States and Venezuela.
But Venezuela isn't a free country. The political opposition has been crushed. Media are censored or controlled by the state. If Maduro wants to end the sanctions, much has to change. No wonder there's so much skepticism.
The socio-economic situation of Venezuela is like a very thin thread that could break.
This is Venezuela, a country that has suffered one of the greatest economic and humanitarian crises in modern history. Today, it appears Nicolas Maduro and his government are prepared to negotiate an agreement that might end U.S. sanctions and pave the way for free and fair elections. Is he really ready to deal, or just setting the stage for another disappointment? I'm Erik Schatzker, and I came here to talk to the power brokers who will decide this country's future. Join me as we go inside Venezuela. Less than a decade ago, Venezuela was the richest country in Latin America, a global oil powerhouse flush with petrodollars. Today, it's one of the poorest, and life for millions is a struggle for survival.
The economy has been flat on its back for 22 years, dragging more and more each day. Every day, hyperinflation abuses us. It doesn't allow us to eat. It doesn't allow us to get medicine.
Venezuela's decline is a story of destructive domestic politics and failed foreign intervention. It started with Hugo Chavez, the self-styled revolutionary, and it continues today with his chosen successor, President Nicolas Maduro. Venezuela used to be the biggest oil exporter to the United States, bigger than Saudi Arabia. But since 2019, U.S. sanctions have kept the country from selling most of its crude and forced it into default.
Imposing economic sanctions on the knowledge that this is going to hurt the population as a whole, it is essentially kind of targeting civilians, or at least doing something that you're aware generates significant collateral damage among non-combatants.
According to government figures, the economic embargo has wiped out some $50 billion a year of export revenue.
Si Venezuela no puede producir petróleo y venderlo,
if Venezuela can't produce oil and sell it, can't produce and sell its gold, can't produce and sell its bauxite, can't produce iron, etc., etc., and can't earn a revenue in the international market, how is it supposed to pay the holders of Venezuelan bonds?
Even Maduro, whose authoritarian regime has withstood U.S. efforts to oust him, is desperate for a deal.
This world has to change. This situation has to change.
Maduro appears on state television multiple times a week, blasting the U.S. government and his political opponents for Venezuela's troubles. But the economy was already in shambles by the time he took office in 2013. Chavez wanted to build a socialist utopia.
Soy socialista, bolivariano, cristiano, y también marxista.
When Chavez came into power, there were 4 steps you had to take to export a container of chocolate.
That's Jorge Redmond, CEO of Chocolates El Rey. He makes some of Venezuela's finest chocolate and sells it all over the world.
Today, there's 90 steps. And there are 19 ministries involved in this process of permissions and documents and whatever. So if we could go back to 4 or 5 steps, that would be a big help for our business. And that's just an example of everything else that goes on.
The U.S. sanctions go back to the presidency of George W. Bush and continued under Barack Obama. They intensified during the Trump administration, especially after Venezuela's 2018 election. Maduro won, but international observers said his victory was a sham.
The main reason why Maduro is still there is not a lack of unity. We've had almost perfect unity in the last 12 years in Venezuela through primaries, consensus, demonstrations, and institutional legitimacy in the case of the president of the parliament. The main reason is because Maduro is a dictator.
Juan Guaido, the leader of Venezuela's legislature, is whom the U.S. recognizes as president, not Maduro.
Today there is more pressure on Maduro and his regime. What they pretended was social control degenerated into a total lack of control. Because today they can't even ensure a supply of gasoline. The country with the world's largest proven oil reserves does not have gasoline, so farmers can transport their food from the countryside to the city.
Across the country, drivers line up for hours, sometimes days, to fill up with gas. Venezuela's once mighty oil industry has been crippled. Production that peaked at almost 3.5 million barrels a day shrank to just 310,000, not enough to meet domestic demand.
2 days, more or less approximately, to line up for tomorrow. If we're lucky, tomorrow they'll fill up with gasoline.
From today until tomorrow. I have to spend the whole night here until tomorrow.
It's a disaster. A total disaster. Losing a day, a whole day of work, of rest, an entire day.
In June of 2021, Oil Minister Tarek Al-Aissami predicted the lineups would be gone in weeks. But they're still here. Across the country, infrastructure is crumbling. Poverty is everywhere. Slums blanket the hillsides as far as the eye can see. And without access to vaccines, COVID-19 is ravaging the population.
My God, we have to get out of this. Lord, please. Enough waiting already. Mr. President, please, make it so these people are vaccinated. Help them.
There have never been so many poor people in Venezuela. Public services were never this bad. The income of the Venezuelan family has never been as low as today. None of the people you see here have been vaccinated, even though there is a pandemic.
Enrique Capriles is a former state governor and presidential candidate.
I think that the socio-economic situation of Venezuela is like a very thin thread that could break. It has not broken, but it could break.
Maduro knows things can't go on like this. Already, he started to unwind many of Chávez's policies.
If the restrictions, the sanctions, the persecution of the bank accounts, of the finances, of the economy, of the oil production that were forced on Venezuela, if they were forced on another country of the world, what would happen? What would they do? That's what we should ask ourselves. Look at the globe, point to another country and see what would happen. How that would affect their reality. Well, Venezuela has had to declare a war economy. We are acting on a war economy.
Price controls are mostly gone. Gasoline subsidies have been reduced. Public spending was slashed. Maduro had little choice. The economy was in a free fall. Inflation became a national obsession.
In Venezuela, there have already been 2 devaluations and the third is coming. One in 2008 and another devaluation in 2018. In 2008, they removed 3 zeros from the currency, and in 2018, they removed 5 zeros. And they are planning to remove 6 zeros from the currency. It means that inflation in Venezuela exceeds 10 zeros. This is hyperinflation. The currency is useless.
This is the worst. I mean, I don't mean to be so negative, but in Venezuela, we've never seen something like this. We have heard and read about inflations in Argentina and in Chile and Brazil, and we've always thought, well, that's their problem. But now we find that it's very much our problem.
Venezuela's official currency, the bolivar, is almost worthless. Even the most basic goods cost millions. Nowadays, prices for just about everything are in dollars. the government is letting them circulate freely.
Starting in November, we started using only dollars and to write down people's names who use dollars. Because the bolivar is useless. I was selling something to people for 20 million bolivars, and soon after, I couldn't buy anything with those 20 million.
Dollarization has improved life for many. Store shelves that sat empty only a few years ago are full again. Zelle, the app that draws on dollars in U.S. bank accounts, is hugely popular.
Lowering inflation rates is not capitalist. It's preserving and defending the purchasing power of workers. Generating more food production is not capitalist. It's guaranteeing the food security of the Venezuelan people, a blockaded country.
Delcy Rodriguez, Maduro's vice president, is the architect of all these reforms.
Today, the Venezuelan private sector is becoming less dependent on oil income. It's becoming a sector that invests, produces, and it's finding space in Venezuela to develop its potential.
Jorge Redmond is still waiting for a rebound.
I'd like to believe in it, and I think in the end, I think the government has come to the conclusion that they need to do that because nothing works.
Our economy had already collapsed, so Maduro was forced to acknowledge under the circumstances the dollarization. Maduro never established the dollarization. He didn't do it actively. It happened to him in order for his dictatorship to survive politically.
For Maduro, it's a tricky balancing act. 1 minute, he's almost begging for negotiations to end the U.S. sanctions. The next, he's denouncing Yankee imperialism.
I would say to President Joe Biden, stop from the White House, from the State Department. Stop the demonization of Venezuela, the demonization of the Bolivarian Revolution, the demonization of President Nicolas Maduro. Hopefully we can find paths of closeness, of respect, paths of mutual benefit, and paths that allow us to normalize relations between the United States and Venezuela.
Just how far is Maduro willing to go? Or is he stalling for time? That's next on Inside Venezuela. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro says he wants a deal to ease the U.S. sanctions that crippled his country's economy.
To establish a real, objective, credible, verifiable foundation and a negotiation process to normalize relations between the two countries in win-win terms, which has been our goal for a long time.
For the first time in years, there's some reason for optimism. The U.S. remains deeply concerned about the ongoing crisis in Venezuela, and the Biden administration has set conditions for meaningful progress, starting with electoral conditions that abide by international standards for democracy.
The optimist in me, makes me say that the sort of magnetic pull between the United States and Venezuela will overcome everything else.
What hasn't changed is the assessment of Maduro himself. Here's how President Trump summed it up during his last State of the Union.
The United States is leading a 59-nation diplomatic coalition against the socialist dictator of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro. Maduro is an illegitimate ruler, a tyrant who brutalizes his people, but Maduro's grip on tyranny will be smashed and broken. Here this evening is a very brave man who carries with him the hopes, dreams, and aspirations of all Venezuelans. Joining us in the gallery is the true and legitimate president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido. Mr. President, please take this message back to your family.
Maduro not only outlasted Trump, He insists the former president was ready to negotiate.
We always had contact with Donald Trump. I was about to meet with Donald Trump personally in September of 2018, when I went to the United Nations General Assembly in New York. We received the call from the White House, but we know about the pressures John Bolton and other officials around Donald Trump were applying to prevent what he wanted, which was a meeting with me. Had we met, history might be different.
You were going to go?
We were going to meet in New York. We made all the arrangements by phone to meet in New York. But in the end, the pressure was too much for him, for Donald Trump, and contact was canceled.
Lately, Maduro has been giving ground. He moved 6 political detainees from prison to house arrest, gave the opposition seats on an elections council, and allowed the World Food Program into Venezuela.
Pierde Trump.
Trump lost. There is a new administration in Washington. That administration believes that positions need to be aligned with Europe, believes that the international community needs to be aligned in the search for the recovery of democracy in Venezuela. They are ready to accompany and support the negotiation process. There are also people in Maduro's side who have noticed that the existential conflict is not good in the position they are in because there is no way to recover the country economically. I imagine the government is under heavy internal pressure.
A new round of talks between the government and the opposition is underway, mediated by Norway.
But the reality is that negotiations in Venezuela have consistently and systematically failed. So this is not the first attempt at negotiations, nor the second, nor the third.
But dialogue is a constructive step after the uprisings and insurgencies that failed to topple Maduro in 2017 and 2019. Inside the opposition, divisions are sharp. One side favors a step-by-step approach, the gradual easing of sanctions in exchange for concessions. The other side, led by Guaido, wants to keep the sanctions in force and only recently agreed to negotiate. What everyone can agree on is that conflict and confusion only help Maduro.
En definitiva, estos regímenes autoritarios.
These authoritarian regimes want to win by wearing out, by getting the world tired of fighting, by getting Venezuelans tired of demanding. That is what happened in Cuba at the time. I'm going to be very clear. We are not going to get tired of fighting or demanding our rights, because that is something very important.
Que no creen que esto hay que construirlo.
It is true that the government has cheated, deviated, but it is also true that we have made very costly mistakes. Every time we have advanced, we have arrived at a dead end. And in the end, the result hasn't weakened Maduro, but strengthened him in his position of power.
Y bueno, al final el resultado ha sido no de debilitar a Maduro, sino más bien de fortalecerlo en su posición de poder.
Maduro faces a big test in November of 2021, regional elections.
The next few months are critical to get international observers lined up for the November elections.
Will he let Venezuelans vote freely and fairly? That and more coming up in this Bloomberg special report, Inside Venezuela. Venezuela's disputed election in 2018 made President Nicolas Maduro a pariah in the West and provoked a crushing series of U.S. sanctions. Now he has a chance to reverse the damage. If the regional elections in November 2021 are considered free and fair enough, the Biden administration might relieve some of the pressure on the Venezuelan economy and its people.
I would create a humanitarian oil for food program so that Venezuela can regain access to the oil revenues that it's lost because of sanctions, and it can use them in addressing its economic and humanitarian crisis.
It appears Maduro is willing to make concessions, though he clearly won't surrender all of his negotiating leverage.
You can't put a gun to the head of the people of Venezuela with the United States telling us what we need to do. We would turn into a colony. We would turn into a protectorate.
The path forward is strewn with obstacles, like the political opposition. It's fragmented, and there's no one leader to rally around.
The president that is as unpopular as Maduro, that has so mismanaged the economy, and that is accused of the type of atrocities that Maduro is accused of, cannot win an election. What can happen is that the opposition can lose it. The opposition is in such disarray right now.
Then there's the government. From the outside, it looks like Maduro has absolute authority. Inside, it's a different story.
I'm not sure that you could say that Maduro is a traditional dictator. In other words, he doesn't really have full control. It's not a one-man, it's not l'état c'est moi. That's not the position he's in. He really has to balance off a lot of the competing factions within his own party.
The longer it takes to reach a solution, the longer Maduro has to fortify his position. Without access to oil markets, he turned to China, Russia, Iran, and Cuba for help. And in Caracas, there's evidence the economy is growing again. For now, Venezuela can't issue, repay, or restructure its debt, and sanctions bar U.S. investors from trading the bonds. They're worth just pennies on the dollar.
En este momento, Venezuela tiene voluntad de pago.
Right now, Venezuela wants to pay, but it can't because of the blockade. I'm not going to tell you our strategy, but I will note our willingness and our commitment. Venezuela has always been a good borrower.
Lo que se llama en el argot cotidiano y coloquial, somos un buen pagador.
Hans Humes owns Venezuelan bonds and makes frequent trips to Caracas. If the trading ban gets dropped and the government is allowed to negotiate with its lenders, he says it could be a bonanza.
Something in the sort of 50-60 range on a net present value basis, I don't think is out of the question.
Latin America has a long history of authoritarian regimes. Venezuela's surely won't be the last. Yet Maduro is clearly longing for a future that looks more like the past he once knew.
I've driven with my wife. I've driven in New York. I myself have driven New York, Boston, Baltimore, Philadelphia, the whole East. I've driven in Miami. I've had a little drink and I have danced salsa on Calle Ocho of Miami. I know the United States, Atlanta. I've gone to the place where the remains of Martin Luther King are and all those neighborhoods. I've gone through them.
While Trump was president, many thought military intervention was the best way to change the regime in Venezuela. That's no longer on the table.
Yo no apoyaría un golpe de Estado.
I will not support a coup d'etat. A coup d'etat is what led Venezuela to this catastrophe. In 1992, Chavez tried to seize power by force. Speaking of resentment and hate to a certain sector of society, and we're seeing the consequences now. All that was accomplished was disaster, catastrophe.
Francisco Rodriguez was chief economist to Venezuela's Congress during the Chavez years. He doesn't think there's any chance Maduro will step down before the 2024 presidential election. Not unless the U.S. gives him the one thing he craves: recognition as president, legitimacy in exchange for an orderly exit.
Maduro would be essentially committing to not running again, to stepping down in 2024 at the end of his term. And you could do something that changes the Venezuelan situation, that opens up the space for a transition, for a new figure to emerge, which might come from Chavismo, might come from the opposition, but which will essentially allow the country to take a step forward.
Will he or won't he run in 2024? It could be the most consequential question for Venezuela's future. Maduro won't say.
My destiny, my future, honestly, it's not the most important thing. The most important thing is the country, and that's where our efforts are focused.